There we go. Right. So nice to see you this evening. And as usual, before we dive into looking at the chunk of the Zohar that I grabbed for this evening, and it's quite a long chunk, I'm afraid, so I'm not sure we'll get through the whole thing. But I'll just give a little bit of introduction on what the Zohar is. I know many of you have heard it many times, but as we have someone who's new to Zohar, Esther, welcome, give a little bit of a brief intro. Hello, Lizzie and Andrew, who just joined us. So for those who maybe aren't as familiar, the Zohar is it's not really a book. It's an anthology of mostly medieval midrashim, and a collection of midrashic teachings that were probably compiled over a long period of time, which together outline a kind of mythology of God, which focuses a lot on gender, on sexuality, and often on unconventional interpretations of the Torah. As strange and radical as some of the things we've seen sometimes in our study of the Zohar have been, all of them are very well sourced in rabbinic literature. So if you ever read something in the Zohar and you go, that's crazy, it might be, but actually the rabbis who are composing it or retelling it are in fact drawing on rabbinic literature that precedes them, just often more obscure rabbinic literature, unusual midrashim, Aggadic texts from the Talmud, places that often many people won't have looked at in depth. So the Zohar is not actually a huge break with earlier Jewish tradition, although it might seem like it to us. In many ways, the Zohar is a very conservative text, which is attempting to preserve an understanding of Judaism which it thinks is the original and authentic one. If you keep in mind that the time the Zohar is published, around the year 1200, maybe slightly before, maybe a little bit after, somewhere between the year 1200 and 1300, debates rage. It is published in a environment in Christian Spain, the north half of Spain, in which the thought of Maimonides has become predominant. And the Zohar is in many ways attempting to restructure a vision of Judaism which is a reaction to and response to Maimonides. So Maimonides says God is unknowable and very simple and doesn't have any gender or attributes or emotions. And the Zohar says, forget all that. God is a much more complicated thing than you understand. The Zohar is several things at once. It is a midrash on the Torah. It goes through the parashiot. It rarely actually talks about what's in the parasha that it claims it's talking about, but we can forgive them, they're rabbis. It's also a kind of medieval novel of travel, and much like the Canterbury Tales were for English literature, the Zohar is a collection of stories about individuals. Today, actually, we're going to see quite in depth one of those individuals and their story, which is a way of teaching. So it describes the adventures and discussions of a small group of rabbis. That novel setting takes place in the 2nd century in the land of Israel, among the earliest group of rabbis, and particularly around a rabbi named Shimon bar Yochai, sometimes called Rashbi. Just for context, he was a real person, Rashbi, Shimon bar Yochai. He was the primary student of Rabbi Akiva, who was one of the most significant rabbis of his generation. He did live in the period of time between kind of 130 and 160 CE. He was known to be a bit eccentric and perhaps a bit of a mystic. The teachings that the Zohar claims in his name were not actually taught by him during his lifetime, or at least we don't have sources that say so. So the Zohar is largely inventing and structuring the idea of his teachings. Very nice. So you guys have been recently to Meron, where he is buried. So at Meron, you may have noticed the mountain in the north of Israel outside of Sfat. Not only is Rabbi Shimon bar Yochai buried there, there's also someone named Rabbi Yitzhak buried there. Rabbi Yitzhak is going to be one of the people we're looking at today, and the story of how he was saved from death by Rabbi Shimon bar Yochai. And as a result, the Zohar not only tells us a story, but verges into a discussion around what happens when someone is about to die. So the passage that we're looking at today is about the process of death and the end stage of life, and what the Zohar imagines is happening when someone is preparing to die, and what's happening in the world as a whole when death is coming for someone in particular. It's quite fantastical, and as I said, it's quite a long passage, so if we don't get through all of it, it's okay. I can send around the text if anyone doesn't have it. I'll share it on the screen in a moment. we are going to be using, as we always do, text that I've scanned from the Pritzker Zohar, which is this lovely yellow volume. It's actually published in 12 volumes. Might be able to see behind me the garish yellow color there. And it is the best and most reliable text of the Zohar because the Zohar is written in a purposely cryptic, encoded version of imaginary 2nd century Aramaic. So it's not written in Hebrew, nor is it written in a real Aramaic that anyone would have spoken. It's written in Aramaic in order to make it seem as though it's much older than it is. So the rabbis who compose it or publish it or finally bring it to light in the 12th century, 13th century are framing it as though it's an ancient text they just discovered. It's probably not. That doesn't mean it's any less valuable to us, but it was a common thing at the time to find something or claim you found something very old, and thus to be able to introduce really radical ideas by virtue of saying, oh, well, it's much older than you think. So the Zohar claims and is unself-consciously telling us that it's actually the teachings of Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai and his friends. It's probably mostly not, but some of it may actually go back to that time period. Whatever it is, it's a distillation of 1,000 years of mystical speculation from the period of Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai in the 2nd century until the 12th century when it's finally brought to light. After it's published, it has a huge influence on Jewish communities. Some reject it, but most accept it as being a core Jewish text, and it becomes the basis of most Jewish mysticism ever since. Many may have heard the incorrect teaching that you're not allowed to study the Zohar unless you're male, married, and 40. That only applies to very few of us here in this room, Zoom room. And actually, that comes about only because the influence of the Zohar on the Shabbatian movement in the 16th and 17th century. Shabtai Tzvi was a false messiah. He was very successful at it, and he led a lot of people astray. The rabbis at the time, trying to recover from the damage that Shabtai Tzvi did, claimed that it was all the Zohar's fault. If the Zohar hadn't corrupted the youth, then they never would have gone astray and followed this false messiah guy. So they said, okay, no one can learn the Zohar anymore. Naturally, anytime you ban something, people want to read it more, and it's only become more popular and more valued in the time since. And this version that we're looking at, this English translation, is, as I said, probably the most reliable because it's been done in a scholarly way from a critical edition of a recomposed Aramaic text by Danny Matt, who's a professor of religion at Berkeley in California, and is probably one of the best experts on Zohar alive today. He's a Masorti Jew, and it's an interesting window into the fact that the Zohar has always been the unique province of very religious communities and often has been rejected by progressive Judaism. Partially that's because Reform, conservative, Masorti, progressive, liberal, whatever, have wanted to seem very modern and very sensible and ethical monotheism and all that nonsense. And so they very easily threw out the Zohar as superstition, magic, and cod swallop, or whatever that word is, poppycock. Alas, it's probably none of those things. And so we're really trying to recover an understanding of what the Zohar teaches us and the influence it's had on Judaism since and what it might mean for us today. I don't claim that it's 100% accurate and that what we're going to read is necessarily the truth. That would be foolish. But I do think it's quite interesting and hopefully challenges our perceptions of what Judaism teaches or doesn't. Any questions about that before we dive in? Cool. So as usual, I've tried to find a passage that's interesting to look at, which is from the section that we're reading this week. So this is from the commentary on Parashat VaYeḥi, which is our parasha for this week. And we're going to start here where it says Rabbi Yitzhak. This is page 313, as you can see. You'll notice that there's a great deal of footnotes. We're not going to dwell on the footnotes unless it's useful to us, but they are incredibly useful for the serious student of Zohar. Danny Matt has done us all a big service by cross-referencing what the Zohar has to teach. So what we're aiming to read is the text above the line, the larger text. And the goal is, as we've always done, we're going to go around, take turns reading in English, discuss what we're reading, try and understand what the Zohar is teaching, and then ask what perhaps it might mean to us today. So who wants to start reading for us? I'm going to volunteer people. Transitive verb volunteer people. Robin, are you volunteering yourself? Good. Reflexive verb volunteer. That's good. Yeah. That's better.
Rabbi Yitzhak was sitting one day at Rabbi Yehuda's door, and he was sad. Rabbi Yehuda emerged and found him by his gate, sitting in sadness. He said to him, "How is this day different from others?"
Okay, so just to set the scene, I'll pause you there, Robin, for a minute. Right, we have two of the rabbis in Rashbi's inner circle, Yitzhak and Yehuda. Doesn't really matter who they are in real history, although both are real people. But the scene is that Rabbi Yehuda wakes up one morning, opens his door to find the sunlight and his friend Yitzhak sitting outside his door crying. Something that maybe many of us have experienced. See one of your friends outside your door crying in the morning, you know something's wrong. He asks the very Jewish question, sounds like the Seder, how is this day different from all other days? Right? What's wrong is the real meaning of that. Carry on.
He replied, "I've come to ask you three things. One, when you speak a word of Torah and you mention some of the words that I have said, that you say them in my name, mentioning my name. Another, that you render my son Joseph worthy through Torah. And another, that you go to my grave all 7 days and offer a prayer for me."
Okay, so his sad friend Yitzhak says, what's wrong? He says, all right, I've got 3 requests. Right, 1, when you teach Torah that I've taught you, say it's from me. 2, will you take care of my son Joseph? He's a good lad. And 3, will you make sure you go and say the prayers for me at my grave? So he doesn't say, I'm going to die, but obviously that's the implication. He says it without saying it. And Rabbi Yehuda is insightful enough to understand what's really going on, which is that Yitzhak believes he's about to die.
Okay.
Yeah.
He said to him, "How do you know?" He replied, "Look, my soul departs from me every night and does not enlighten me with a dream as before. Further, when I pray and reach who hears prayer, I look for my tselem on the wall and do not see it. So I conclude that since the tselem has disappeared and can no longer be seen, the herald has already gone forth and issued the proclamation, as it is written, only with the tselem does a human walk about. As long as a person's tselem does not disappear, a human walks about, his spirit sustained within him. Once a person's tselem passes away and cannot be seen, he passes away from this world."
Okay, so why does Rabbi Yitzhak think he's going to die?
He can't dream like he used to, and he can't see his shadow when he's praying.
Good, right? So tselem notably is untranslated here because it's a bit vague what he means. It can mean shadow. Obviously, in modern Hebrew, tsel, a version of this word, means shadow. Tselem is also the word used in Genesis to refer to the creation of human beings, but tselem Elohim, in the image of God. It's some kind of astral body, we might say, in modern New Age parlance. Right? It's some kind of version of himself, a spiritual body, which evidently he can see on the wall. Now that implies a shadow, doesn't it? That normally when he's praying and he reaches the phrase Shomea Tefillah, that's in the Amidah, it's one of the blessings in the Amidah, he sees his shadow on the wall, but recently he hasn't been seeing it. His shadow has disappeared. Right, so he concludes that since he can't see a shadow, a herald has gone forth and issued a proclamation, meaning it must have been announced that I'm going to die. So what does this imply about how he understands death?
That it's inevitable, or that it's foreseeable, and that when your time comes, and someone goes and announces it, and the process starts.
Very good. The process starts. Very key, Robin, right? This is a process, clearly. He has foreknowledge of the fact that his death is coming because of real material evidence. Material evidence, and perhaps a bit of a stretch, but he no longer is dreaming, and he can no longer see his shadow. And for him, these are obvious indications that death is near, that his body is starting to separate from his soul. And this seems to be obvious as part of the understanding. Once a person's tselem passes away and can't be seen, he passes away from this world. Right? So the lack of a shadow is a warning sign that you're about to die, as is evidently not having dreams. Okay?
Isn't there also a midrash which talks about how just before we're born, an angel comes and like takes our soul and says like this one for this one, and then like another soul is like grabbed, and that's supposed to be the person that we'll marry, and it's like this one for this one. So this is kind of like at the beginning, God kind of like picks up our souls and like assigns them a role, and then like when that soul is kind of, I don't know, it feels like the opposite of that.
Yeah, very. So there is right. It's very much operating under the same assumption as those midrashic stories, which is that there is a process going on that we're not aware of, a somewhat bureaucratic process going on, in which life and death is kind of arranged and sorted. You can almost imagine, in kind of the way that it's often been depicted in modern TV, like The Good Place, that there's kind of a, someone is sitting there going, okay, this soul's going into the world, and someone in an office goes, all right, this soul's supposed to leave the world, go announce it, go take the shadow. There's a procedure that's going on involving these kind of angelic representatives of God's will, which is all very mechanistic. As you said, Robin, it's kind of inevitable from this. And yet it's something that defines our birth and death. And it's more than just the assigning people their partner for life. There's also the idea that angels teach you everything that's going to happen in life, and then it's all removed from you. And that's why you have the divot in your lip, is because where the angel presses you when you're born. There's all of these ideas around kind of the process of being ensouled and the reverse process of being desouled. Right, and that's really the key thing, is that obviously for them, the soul, this spiritual entity, is the real thing, and the body is just a temporary abode. And we can see that there's indications, there's scientific indications of the fact that the soul's time is expiring in its body by virtue of what we see around us.
I don't
do you want to go on a bit further? Sorry, Rotem.
I don't know if it will be interesting for you guys, but for me, it jumped straight away. I really thought about Jung, because it's very like, it's speaking about dreams and the shadow. And Jung, it's all about like how we go into individuation and getting to know ourselves through dreams and getting to know our shadows. And if we don't see our shadows, it's almost like we don't exist, like we don't have.
Yeah, very good. Very good. So absolutely, there's an imagery here which is not really explained, but Jung is a different class. But Jung kind of definitely draws a lot on Jewish mysticism, and he didn't really tell us his sources, but some of them are the Zohar. But one of the things that he talks about is that the shadow obviously is key as a concept to personalization. So you can imagine as a result that the same idea of the shadow being removed is kind of an indication that the individual is diminishing. But it is gradual, right? Death is not a moment in this, it's a process. And that's what's interesting, is there's indications of that process before the moment of death occurs. Anyone ever sat by the side of someone as they die and watched them die? Yes. So you may have felt similarly that actually you can see certain things happening, that there's kind of an indication that something is transitioning. Many people will report that it feels a little bit more like a process than an event when you're there with someone. And it's very hard to actually pinpoint what the exact moment of death is, because there's lots of things that seem to happen both before that moment and after. Right, often the body continues to move even after someone is pronounced dead. Many people will say that they feel like something's gone. Right, there's actually a moment where they feel like something has changed and the soul isn't there anymore. Some people even describe seeing or feeling or experiencing that, of seeing and experiencing the soul leave the body. Either way, there's a sense here very much in the Zohar that that's something that happens slowly and that there's indications of it beforehand. Let's read on a bit further.
He said to him, and from here, as is written, for our days upon earth are a shadow. He said, all these things that you ask I will do, but I ask of you to select my place in that world next to you, just as we were in this world.
Lovely, right? What is Rabbi Yehuda's response? I'll do what you said, but save me a seat. Yeah. Which I think is a very, very good pastoral response, by the way. He doesn't try and argue with him about his conception of his own mortality and death. He just says, okay, well, if you get there first, save me a seat. Love it. Go on.
Rabbi Yehuda wept and said, please let me stay with you through all these days. They went to Rabbi Shimon and found him engaged in Torah. Rabbi Shimon raised his eyes and saw Rabbi Yitzhak, and he saw the angel of death running in front of him, dancing.
Okay, now remember Rabbi Shimon, this is Shimon Bar Yochai, is the leader of this group and the most enlightened and most spiritual of them. And he is able, as a result, to see things that other people can't see. This common trope in the Zohar. And here, what does he see?
The angel of death running. So he can see it all happening.
So he sees even more evidence of the gradual decline of Rabbi Yitzhak. Not only is his shadow gone and he's losing his dreams, but someone like Rabbi Shimon, who can see things others can't, sees the angel of death kind of, making funny faces and dancing around him and, fist pumping or whatever. I love the idea that he's dancing around, right? Why is the angel of death dancing around? Because he's so excited, like, I'm going to get this one soon, which implies it's quite imminent in some way. And I imagine if you saw this around someone else, you'd be quite concerned about them. And about yourself, potentially. Carry on.
Rabbi Shimon rose and grasped Rabbi Yitzhak's hand, saying, I decree, whoever is accustomed to enter may enter, whoever is not accustomed to enter may not. Rabbi Yitzhak and Rabbi Yehuda entered. The angel of death was bound outside. Rabbi Shimon gazed and saw that the time had not yet arrived, for it had been arranged for the 8th hour of the day. Rabbi Shimon seated him in front of him and engaged him in Torah.
Okay, so what does Shimon Bar Yochai do when he sees very sad Yitzhak and his friend Yehuda coming to visit him and notices the angel of death dancing around Yitzhak?
He asks them in and sits him down in front of the Torah, sort of protecting him.
Right, he protects him, and he's able to make almost spell, a declaration, to say, whoever normally comes here, you can come in. Whoever doesn't, can't. It's almost like vampire stories, right? The angel of death is just stuck outside, can't come into the house, because Rabbi Shimon made a declaration that actually anyone who doesn't normally come here is banned. And so we have the angel of death looking in the windows while Yitzhak and Yehuda come in and sit with Rabbi Shimon. Rabbi Shimon is also able to see through his insight that it wasn't quite the right time yet. So this is early in the morning. He says that actually he's meant to die at the 8th hour of the day. Right, so he's very precise. Evidently, he can perceive the proclamation that was made and understand that actually he's going to die at 2 o'clock. And so he's managing to stall the angel of death for a moment. Okay, and he brings him into his house, and we're going to see how he responds to, which is very interesting. Good kind of window into pastoral care, potentially, for those here studying to be rabbis. Someone else want to read for us from He Said to His Son? Thank you, Robin. Very nice job. Janice, was that a hand?
Okay. He said to his son, Rabbi Akiva, sit by the door, and whatever you see, do not speak with it. And if it wants to enter, please place it under oath, not to. Rabbi Simon said to Rabbi Yitzhak, have you seen the image of your father today? For we have learned when a person is about to depart the world, his father and relatives are present with him, and he sees and recognizes them. All of those with whom he shared the same rung in that world, they all gather around him and accompany his soul to a place where she will abide. He replied, I have not yet seen anyone. At once Rabbi Simon rose and said, Master of the world, Rabbi Yitzhak is well known among us. He is one of the 7 eyes. Here, look, I am holding him. Give him to me. A voice issued proclaiming, flying spark of his Lord, enveloped in the wings of Rabbi Simon. Behold, he is yours. You shall bring him with you when you enter to occupy your throne.
Okay, thanks, Janice. So what does Rabbi Shimon do to diagnose the situation in front of him in terms of he's got this one really sad guy who thinks he's going to die, his best friend is there with him, and the angel of death stuck outside the door?
It sort of gives him some guidance and saying, your father and for everybody's going to protect you on this journey almost. And then I didn't quite understand the last 2 paragraphs.
Okay, well, let's go back. That's good. So first he charges his son, who's quite a young boy at this stage, Rabbi Elazar, and tells him, go guard the door and don't let that sneaky angel in. Right? Now, he doesn't say it's the angel of death, but he says, whoever's out there, don't speak with them and don't let them in. Very kind of horror movie vibes here, right? Like, don't let the angel of death in the house. The call's coming from inside the house. And then Rabbi Shimon goes to Rabbi Yitzhak and asks him a question, rewrite Genesis, about this idea of his father. He says, have you seen the image of your father today? Now, we can assume that his father is deceased. And so the question is, have you seen a vision of your dead father today? And then he explains, because we know that when someone is about to die, you see all of your deceased relatives. They come and visit you. They come to accompany you into the next world. And Rabbi Yitzhak says, no, I haven't seen anyone. And as a result, Rabbi Shimon is able to get up and say to God, right, master of the world, this guy's really valuable. He's one of us. Let me have him. Don't take him. And a voice issues from somewhere in this very strange and bizarre language, saying he's yours, right? You can bring him with you when you come. So quite a dramatic turn of events, Zachary.
So there's a thing in Barachot which plays on the use of the word reshef as spark or of demon, and it's like, how do you defeat a demon? And I think it's interesting here that it's like flying spark of God is like the antithesis to like the kind of angel of death, who might be slightly demonic, or I might be reading really far into it. But there's something about like sparks going upwards, which is like it's a force which is imbued with godliness and maybe has like a lot of power against death.
Yeah, there's perhaps something there. We'd have to look at the Aramaic to see. He does give us the word flying spark in Aramaic, which is tesisa, evidently, which he claims is a neologism, right? The meaning that it's a made-up word, as many words in the Zohar are. And the word that he translates as enveloped, karifa, he claims is based on the very obscure rabbinic Hebrew word karfef, which is an enclosure, but it's not so clear. So he says, Danny Matt, this is a conjectural translation of this cryptic Aramaic pronouncement. So it's really hard to make sense of what he's saying, but that implies to us it's a magic spell of some kind, right? The voice is saying something that is nonsensical but effective, which is basically Rabbi Shimon wins, he's yours. It might be linked in some way to the discourse around Reshef and everything that comes with that. And certainly there's lots of spark language, but I don't know that it's a direct connection. Martin, were you gonna say something?
Yeah. So I don't know if you can hear me. The connection's a bit bad, but
we can hear you.
I just noticed the thing about saying when the father you see an image of your father and relatives. But I've like, when you hear about near-death experiences and things like that, people sort of claim to see like members of their like immediate family, like parents and siblings, and those that have departed. So that's sort of a bit of a universal thing, I think.
Absolutely spot on, Martin. This is something that many, 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 many people experience. It is extremely common when someone is near death, that they will kind of become quite disassociated from reality, and very often we'll talk about seeing loved ones who have died. Now, a purely psychological explanation of that is obvious. You could say, well, they're in distress. It's a comfort mechanism. It's a way of avoiding the fear of death. Fine, you can have that psychological interpretation, but there's also a very easy spiritual interpretation of it, as you see here, that actually the souls of the people who have already died come to bring you into the world of the dead, which wouldn't have been unusual to the ancient world, and certainly not to the medieval one, and perhaps shouldn't be unusual to us as well, even if it sounds a bit strange. And it apparently is very obvious, so obvious that they can say, well, everyone knows when someone's about to depart the world, their relatives come to bring them into the world of the dead. And the fact that Rabbi Yitzhak hasn't seen his father or his family implies that maybe there's an opportunity to save him still. Right, I think that's what Rabbi Shimon is seeing is, okay, well, you haven't had your dreams and you haven't seen your shadow. The angel of death is outside because I trapped him there. But maybe there's still some hope that we can rescue you from this fate because you haven't started seeing your relatives coming to get you yet. Right, the process is ongoing. The death process is happening, but Rabbi Shimon diagnoses it as being not far enough along to be inevitable. That actually he can still, through the power of his own magic, basically convince God to release him. And he does. right? He says, leave Rabbi Yitzhak alone. And the voice from heaven says, fine, you take him with you when you come, Rabbi Shimon. And much later, it'll be the case that they both die on the same day, and they're buried in the same place. And this is basically the origin story of why that is. Why did they die on the same day? Oh, it's because this one time he was supposed to die, but Rabbi Shimon saved him by virtue of this magical power, and as a result, he said, I'll take him with me when I come, and that's why he died the same day that Rabbi Shimon did, which, by the way, is Lag BaOmer, which is why we still celebrate that day, or some of us do at least, is because it's the day Rabbi Shimon died. And it's celebrated at Meron, where Zachary and Esther were recently. Okay, so we have this whole amazing, wild, interesting story about this interaction between these two guys. And it's going to lead us now onto a discussion of what happened after, and then as well into the ideas that are there. So let's read on a little bit. Following the voice announcing that he has succeeded. Someone else fancy reading? We can go around. David, Rotem, Zachary, Lizzie, somebody? Don't want to call on people. You're all adults.
Yeah, I think you said my name.
Yeah, go for it.
Great. Rabbi Shimon said, certainly so. Meanwhile, Rabbi Eliezer saw that the angel of death had departed. He said, nothing bound to a glowing ember in the presence of Rabbi Shimon, son of Yochai.
Right, that's his son, by the way. He's been watching the window. He goes, look, the angel of death is gone. Supposedly he didn't know it was the angel of death, but evidently he did. Who knows?
Rabbi Shimon said to his son, Rabbi Eliezer, come in here and hold Rabbi Yitzhak, for I see that he is frightened. Rabbi Eliezer entered and held him, while Rabbi Shimon turned his face and engaged in Torah. Rabbi Yitzhak fell into a slumber and saw his father. He said to him, happy is your share in this world and in the world that is coming. For among the leaves of the tree of life in the Garden of Eden is planted a tree great and mighty in two worlds, Rabbi Shimon son of Yochai. He embraces you with his branches. Happy is your share, my son. He asked him, Father, what, am I there? He replied, for 3 days they have been decorating your bedchamber. They have designed open windows for you, illuminating you from 4 directions. When I saw your place, I rejoiced and said, happy is your share, except that until now your son has not attained the merit of Torah. Just now we were about to come to you, 12 righteous companions, but before we set out, a voice aroused throughout all worlds. Who are the beloved companions here? Adorn yourselves for the sake of Rabbi Shimon. He made a request, and it has been granted.
Okay, just to pause you there for a minute. This is the aftermath of the event, right? In the house, Rabbi Elazar goes, oh, the angel of death left. Rabbi Shimon goes back to studying Torah, and Rabbi Yitzhak, who is the one who is going to die, falls asleep. As soon as he falls asleep, he sees his father, exactly the last sign that he was checking before. So in some way it implies kind of the process is still ongoing, right? Or at least he was about to see his father. It was very, very close. He was about to see his father, and he asked his father in the dream, his dead father, who says, aren't you lucky? You've got a friend like Rabbi Shimon who can protect you, right? Isn't that great for you? And he asked him, what am I there? Right? What's my life going to be like in the world of the dead? And his father says, you have this wonderful spot. They've been decorating your room. You've got windows, right? It's a very nice digs that you're going to have here in the world of the dead. I was very pleased when I saw the space you were going to have. Made me very proud. And actually, we were just about to come get you, right? Me and 12 righteous companions were just about to set out to bring you from the world of living to the world of the dead. And just as we were, it was the craziest thing. This voice just came out of nowhere and said, don't go. Rabbi Shimon has made a request and it has been granted. Right, so we see the same story retold from the point of view of the dead father, who is communicating now with Rabbi Yitzhak in a dream. Okay, let's carry on.
Not only this, for 70 places adorned here belong to him, with every single place opening to 70 worlds, and every single world opening to 70 channels, and every single channel opening to 70 supernal crowns, from which paths open to the Ancient One, concealed of all, to behold the beauty illuminating and delighting all, as it is written, to gaze upon the beauty of Hashem, to contemplate his temple. What does this mean, to contemplate his temple? Corresponding to what is written, in all my house he is trusted.
Okay, so this whole thing is him talking about how great Rabbi Shimon is, right? The dead father talking to Yitzhak, saying not only did he save you, but he's got so much real estate in the world of the dead, right? He's got so much credit over here in the world of the dead. He's got 70 places where he could save people. He's got 70 places with 70 worlds and 70 channels and 70 crowns, and all of it goes right to God. Obviously, it's a huge, overly dramatic, exaggerated description by the dead father of Rabbi Yitzhak about how incredibly powerful Rabbi Shimon is. Not only that he can save him from death, but actually that he's got this whole kind of real estate empire in the world of the dead awaiting him.
He asked him. Oh,
Yeah.
sorry.
No, go on. Go on.
Okay, sorry, I thought I heard someone else speaking. He asked him, Father, how much time has been granted me in that world? He replied, We are not permitted, nor is a human being informed. But at the wedding feast of Rabbi Shimon, you will arrange his table, as is said, O daughters of Zion, come out and gaze upon King Solomon, upon the crown with which his mother crowned him on the day of his wedding, on the day of his heart's delight. At once Rabbi Yitzhak awoke, smiling, his face radiant. Rabbi Shimon noticed and gazed into his face and said, You have heard a new word. He replied, Certainly so. He told him and prostrated himself before Rabbi Shimon.
Okay, just to pause you there. So the end of the father dream story, right? He asked his father in the dream still, how much time has been granted me in that world? That's this one, right? The world of the living. Yeah, meaning how much time do I have left? I've been saved from death today. He has a near-death experience. This is a story about a near-death experience. I've been saved from death today by Rabbi Shimon, but how much time do I have left before I get my bedchamber with all the windows? And he says, well, we actually don't know. Nobody knows. But I do know that you'll be at the wedding feast of Rabbi Shimon, right? In the real world, the world of the living. So he says, you'll be there for a while still. You'll be the one decorating his table and arranging his table. It won't be anytime soon. It's not like he bought you a day. He's bought you a whole extension to your life, that you have a lot more time now on earth. Right? And this, of course, makes Rabbi Yitzhak happy. He wakes up from his dream. His face is radiant. Rabbi Shimon has been busy studying Torah while he's sleeping, looks over and says, oh, you learned something new. He can immediately recognize that he has discovered something new in his dream, and perhaps he suspects that he's had this conversation with his father or other relatives in the world of the dead. Right? The communication between living and dead is obviously very loose and very easy in dreams. Okay, which is, by the way, something widely experienced. People often see or talk to or have conversations with dead relatives in their dreams. You could explain it purely as a psychological manifestation. Doesn't really matter whether it's psychological, real, spiritual, or somewhere in between. For our purposes, it is what it is.
Can I ask?
Yeah, Andrea.
Why does he prostrate himself?
Well, that's a good question. What does prostrate mean, of course?
Pardon?
What does prostrate mean?
Well, I thought bow down to him. Bend
Yeah,
down to him.
precisely. Yeah, he does. He bows down to him, which is very unexpected and unusual in some way from a Jewish text. And obviously you can see here that the Zohar goes slightly outside the lines in terms of what we usually understand as humans and their significance. Rabbi Shimon is understood as a properly kind of semi-divine being, right? He is given a very supernatural status. And so it's not unusual, it seems, for him to be bowing down to Rabbi Shimon, who has these incredible powers. Let's see, he has a note here. I wonder if he gives us anything. He bowed down in thanks to him for saving him from the angel of death. So you could read it as a gesture of gratitude or as a gesture of kind of acknowledgement of what power Rabbi Shimon has. Remember, he's also just learned from his dead father that Rabbi Shimon has so much influence in the world of the dead that he's got all of these chambers waiting for him in that world. So he might just be kind of overwhelmed by emotion to some degree. But it is, notable that you have people bowing down to other people here. Right, the Zohar has no problem with seeing some people as being exceptional or supernaturally gifted, and that those people are kind of more significant, and Rabbi Shimon is the chief among them.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah.
Why is he happy that he has more life? Because, if he knows he's got a place in the world to come, and it sounds quite groovy up there, and, he's even going to be with, his dead relatives, why is he happy to spend more time away from the world to come?
Well, remember the three things he asked of Rabbi Yehuda in the beginning of the story. He said, will you teach Torah in my name when you say things I did? Will you educate my son? And will you visit my grave? And when he speaks to his father, we didn't discuss it, but one of the things his father says, it must have been up above, is, we were about to come get you. You're doing a great job. You're doing all these great things, except you haven't quite educated your son. Where is it?
Until now, your son has not attained the merit of Torah.
Right. So that's the only thing that's missing, right? Is that actually you forgot to properly educate your son. And so perhaps Rabbi Shimon is aware of this and is able to say, no, he's not done. Leave him here for a bit. He's got something to do still. And he must be aware of it because he asked his friend to make sure his son got a proper education. So he clearly has more work to do. Right, and in the classic kind of near-death experience story, something very common in many fictional stories, the hero who is at near death, at death's door, is sent to kind of some heavenly abode where Morgan Freeman says, "It's your time," and he says, "I've got more to do," and then they send him back, and he awakes, from death. So clearly, that's kind of what's happening here to some degree, is that he's got more to do.
It really feels like a story about fathers and sons. Yeah, it's a story about near-death experience, but from the moment also when Rabbi Shimon, I think, takes his son out, it felt a bit like he's guarding him, maybe protecting him from what's happening in the room. Because right after it, he's saying, "Have you seen your father?" And it's known that if you see your father, you're gonna die. And I don't imagine he wants his son to hear it. I don't know.
I think you're absolutely right. There's a really interesting piece here about generations and fathers and sons in particular, right? As usual, there's no women in the story. And in particular, right, we have this kind of different relationship between Rabbi Shimon and his son Elazar, who's kind of his assistant, right? He's able to say, "Keep the angel of death outside, go stand by the window, go do this." And they're working together. Whereas Rabbi Yitzhak, who's about to die, is very worried about his son. We don't know where his son is. We don't know what he knows. And we didn't quite read the conclusion. I cut Zachary off too soon. But just to read the last paragraph here of this particular section, it has been taught. From that day on, Rabbi Yitzhak would grasp his son by the hand and teach him Torah, never leaving him. When he went into Rabbi Shimon, he would seat his son outside and sit before Rabbi Shimon and exclaim, "Oh, Adonai, prolong me, be my guarantor." It's really interesting. So he walks away from the situation with a new commitment to educate his son. And from that day forward, he would teach his son Torah, never leaving him, except when he would go to see Rabbi Shimon, when he would leave him outside.
I was just wondering about Rabbi Shimon. So Rabbi Shimon's son is Rabbi Elazar, but then it says that Rabbi Yitzhak will be at Rabbi Shimon's wedding. So how can this be in those days?
Well, that's a really good.
He's not married.
That's a very good question. They'll note that the explanation here gives us some window into it. He translates it as a wedding feast, but the word is an Arabic word, hilula, which is a wedding feast. It's used colloquially as the day of death. And so we can understand it there, that actually what he means is that you'll be with Rabbi Shimon on the day that he dies. Right, when he says you'll be preparing his wedding banquet, he means you'll be with him when he dies. And by the way, the explanation is very useful in footnote 85. Right, the death of Rabbi Shimon is described as a hilula, a wedding feast, because he then unites with the Shekhinah, that's the feminine aspect of God. Here, Rabbi Yitzhak's father promises his son that he too will play a role in this celebration. Elsewhere in the Zohar, the verse from Song of Songs alludes to the union of Shekhinah and her divine partner, who is crowned by Bina, his mother. Here, Rabbi Shimon assumes the role of the royal groom. Right, so the description of the wedding feast is actually a euphemism for the day that he's going to die. But it's a day of celebration and joy, and they're going to be celebrating together, i.e. they're going to die at the same time.
That makes sense now, okay.
Yeah, I mean, it's quite unusual, but we do still refer in many Sephardic communities, rather than use the term yahrzeit, which means an annual anniversary of a death, of course, a year's time. Some will refer to the day of death as a hilula, a wedding feast, because they take from the Zohar this idea that actually the day of death is a day that we're celebrating when someone joins in a kind of romantic relationship with God and returns to the world of spirituality. This is why, by the way, many Sephardic families on the anniversary of someone's death will go to the cemetery and have a barbecue and sing and play music and whatever else, because actually that's the idea behind the celebration of the day of death. Rather than being a somber affair, it's often a day of joy. Lag BaOmer, this 33rd day of the Omer, is the Hilula of Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai. That's the day he died, and it's properly celebrated with l'chaims galore, haircuts, bows and arrows and huge bonfires. Not a great combination, by the way. Alcohol, bonfires, and weapons. But, you know, living on the edge.
Can I just sort of thinking about the father-son thing that Rotem mentioned? Is it and the sort of almost like the purpose of life? Is the purpose of life almost to educate yourself in the Torah and educate your children in the Torah? Is that it?
Well, I don't think that's it.
Is that what we take from this or not?
I don't think that's the exclusive purpose of life, but it is a high value for them. Having children and educating them is seen as a very high value. Many people are described in the Zohar as being punished for either not having children or having children and not providing for their education. There's many stories, actually, earlier in the Zohar, in lots of the Talmudic literature, about people who are punished to be ghosts or wander the world as kind of malevolent spirits because they failed to provide an education for their children, which, you know, could have served a sociological role for the rabbis in making sure people paid for their kids' school fees, but also represents a kind of value of education more broadly, right? That actually he had the most important work to do, which was provide an education for his son. Not the exclusive role or point of life by any means, but is very central to the value system of this particular text, at least, for sure. Okay, let's go on a little bit more. Now the Zohar goes from the story to the abstract and talks more about this idea of what happens when you die, and what the warnings are like and whatever else, which is quite interesting and bizarre. And it gives us a little bit of a window into how the Zohar teaches. It'll tell us a story. In the story, it teaches ideas, and then it often will then comment on those ideas in more depth, which is what happens now. Someone else fancy reading for us from the top of this page? Got a little bit more time to take a look at some of these texts. Rotem, thank you.
It has been taught, on that fierce and terrifying day for a human, when his time arrives to depart from the world, 4 aspects of the world stand in harsh judgment, and judgments arouse from 4 directions, and 4 clusters quarrel, and wrangling prevails among them as they seek to separate each to its own side.
Okay, just to explain, this description is of the 4 elements. The Greco-Roman ancient conception of the world as being made up of 4 elements: earth, air, fire, water. Right, this is a description of the body starting to disintegrate. Right, the 4 different things are kind of tangling and wrangling with each other as the body starts to fall apart. Okay.
A herald emerges and proclaims in that world, and it is heard in 270 worlds. If he is virtuous, all those worlds rejoice in welcoming him. If not, woe to that human being and to his share.
Right, an idea that we saw reflected earlier implicitly in the text, which is that the death of each person is proclaimed. There's a kind of ticker that goes every day. Someone comes out and says, this person's going to die today at 2:37, and evidently it's announced not only in the world in which you live, but also in other worlds, which seems quite impractical. I think that would clog up the kind of radio feed of the other worlds. But in 270 worlds, it's announced that you're going to die in this world. And as a result, if you're virtuous and righteous, then all of the people in all of those worlds are excited for you, because it means that you'll be rewarded with the kind of vision of the afterlife we saw earlier. If actually you're on the naughty list, then you should be worried. And everyone's a little bit worried for you. Which is a very black and white idea of reward and punishment, obviously. The language of the Zohar often verges into what seems to us to be much more Christian thinking around life and death, which is certainly the case here to some degree. Kind of, it's not quite saying heaven and hell, the Christian ideas of heaven and hell, but we're getting there. We're getting to an idea that there's kind of 2 places to go.
Yeah. It has been taught, when the herald proclaims, a flame issues from the side of the north and blazes in the river of fire, diverging in 4 directions of the world and burning the souls of the wicked. That flame shoots forth up and down through the world and reaches the wings of a black rooster, striking its wings, and it crows at the opening between the gates.
Okay, we're getting into crazy imagery territory, so we'll just pause for a second. So first of all, we have another teaching, and they don't always necessarily make sense with each other, that there's some kind of river of fire and a flame emerges from it when the herald proclaims, and those who are not deserving of being called righteous, those who are wicked, actually their soul gets burnt up in their body, so it doesn't go on at all. So we're introducing more of an idea here that actually there only is an afterlife for the virtuous. And the wicked actually just kind of, their souls get burned to a crisp before they can go on anywhere else. It's not like they go to some kind of hell dimension. It's actually just that they don't have an afterlife. That's the punishment, it seems, which is an unusual idea, not one we see in too many places. I think he gives us some helpful sources down here in the comment. He just tells you to look on the river of fire. And now they introduce this idea of the flame as it's shooting throughout. It reaches the wings of a black rooster. Striking its wings and crowing at the opening between the gates.
Sorry, a rooster is a chicken?
A rooster is a male chicken, yeah, the kind that of course call out the opening of the morning, and often much larger, and of course have very fancy feathers and everything, as many male birds do. They're the more decorated and more beautiful of the two sexes. It's very unusual. In fact, I've never seen a black rooster. I don't know if anyone else has. I don't think a black rooster exists. I could be wrong. Google can certainly tell us. But they imagine that there's a black rooster as part of this river of fire and incineration of bad souls. So let's see a little bit more about the black rooster, and then we'll see what they say about it. So, you want to continue, Rotem?
The first time it cries, see, a day is coming for Hashem, burning like a furnace.
Mm-hmm.
The second time it cries, for see, he forms mountains and creates wind, and declares to a human what his conversation was. At that moment, a person sits among his deeds, which testify before him, and he confesses them. The third time, as they are about to extract his soul, the rooster cries, "Who would not fear you, O King of the nations, for it befits you."
Very good. So they have this incredibly bizarre mythology of the rooster in its cries calling out biblical verses, right, from Malachi, Amos, and Yirmiyahu. And each time kind of something progresses. You imagine this kind of very scary situations. And in between the second and third cries of the rooster, all of the deeds that you've done kind of emerge and all tell of what all the bad things you did. It sounds like a psychological torture, right? This whole kind of vision of you having to hear your deeds confess about you, and the rooster's crying, and there's a river of fire, and it's citing biblical verses and whatever else. It's really quite a crazy image. And my favorite thing is that one of the rabbis listening to this, Rabbi Yossi, goes, "A black rooster, what difference does it make?" Just cracks me up, right? Lest we think we're the only ones going, what the hell is happening? Rabbi Yossi also goes, who cares whether it's a black rooster or some other kind of rooster? This is bonkers. And of course, it's quite a strange thing. Now, those who are familiar with the morning blessings will know that the first blessing that we recite, right, Lasech Vivina, is to give the intellect of knowledge and wisdom to people, is meant to be recited when you hear the rooster cry. Right, so the assumption, of course, is that you live in an agricultural society, you have a rooster outside. When you hear the rooster cry, you say the first blessing of the day, which is, blessed is God who gives understanding and wisdom to people, and the understanding to discern between one thing and another. So that's where imagery comes from here. Roosters distinguish between one thing and another, in this case between the righteous and the wicked, and they connect it in the next section to the imagery of the rooster as being about wisdom and alluding to wisdom, and how black is a symbol of judgment, and that's why it's a black rooster and whatever else, and that's very suitable for it to be a black rooster. They go on about the black rooster for a while. We're going to kind of, I think, skip over that a little bit. And I just want to draw your attention to these two paragraphs here, which get quite bleak, actually. And sorry, it's getting quite strange, where we see you actually moving into an explicit understanding of hell, right? When a person sees close to him his relatives and friends from that world, and he recognizes them all engraved in the image they possessed in this world, if he's virtuous, they rejoice and greet him. But if he's not virtuous, he cannot recognize them. except for the wicked ones who are tormented every day in hell. They're all gloomy, opening with woe, closing with woe. He raises his eyes and sees them like a flying cinder ascending from fire. He too opens with woe. All right, so I love this incredibly dark teaching that actually when you die and your family comes to visit you, if you're righteous, you'll recognize them and you'll all celebrate and you'll go off and have a nice time. If you've been wicked, you won't be able to recognize them anymore. You'll only see the ones who are being punished and who cry out woe, and then you'll feel like woe, and you won't even recognize your righteous family in front of you, which is very dark. All right? Another teaching, again, all of these are kind of separate teachings. When a person's soul departs, all his relatives and friends in that world accompany his soul and show it its place of delight and its place of punishment. If he's virtuous, he sees his place and ascends and dwells and delights in the supernal bliss of that world. If he's not virtuous, the soul remains in this world until the body is buried in the earth. Once it is buried, numerous wardens of law seize it until it reaches Duma, which means silence, and is brought into the abodes of hell. Right, so this is even darker in some way, that before you die, you're given a tour of you could be here or you could be here, right? Let's see which one it is. And then when you die, either you go to the good place where you saw, or if you wake up and you're still in your body, then you should be concerned because it means that the wardens of the law are coming to get you. I actually think it's wonderfully refreshing to just see very explicitly very dark conceptions of what these things entail. It does feel very Christian in some regards, but it all links back in some way to the story that starts with. Last thing I want to draw our attention to, and there's a lot more here, but we're going to skip around a bit, is this lovely teaching from Rabbi Yehuda. Remember, Rabbi Yehuda is the friend at the beginning of our story who comforted Rabbi Yitzhak, who saw he was going to die. He says all 7 days, that is of Shiva, the 7 days of Shiva, of mourning, the soul goes from his house to his grave, and from his grave to his house, mourning over the body, as is written, surely his flesh feels pain for him, and his soul mourns for him. She goes and sits in the house, sees all of them sad, and mourns. I just love the idea, and as dark as it's sad as it might be, that actually during the days of Shiva, the soul is actually kind of walking back and forth between the grave and the house where everyone's sitting around talking about that person and remembering them and praying for them, and it has to have its own mourning process. Right? The soul actually has to grieve for itself before it can move on. It's an interesting combination of pieces here. We don't have time necessarily to go into more of them, but I encourage you to consider some of these ideas more, just to kind of tie it together, because we've been a bit piecemeal. The story that we primarily looked at about Rabbi Yitzhak and his near-death experience, it introduces to us the idea that death is a process, that it happens gradually, that there's signs that death is impending before one dies, that there's ways to avert that, at least Rabbi Shimon, because of his merits, is able to avert that, and that actually there's ongoing processes in the world of the dead which affect us in the world of the living, and the ability to communicate and understand our role in the world of the dead. And even the last bit from Rabbi Yehuda, that the soul is actually outside the windows of the Shiva house, looking in, grieving for itself, gives us an indication of how we should, perhaps according to the Zohar, understand grief and death and bereavement, that it is in fact a long process. It starts before someone dies, while they're still alive, and it continues after someone dies. And the event of death itself is actually just one moment in that process, but death is a process and not an event. That's one of the key things of all of these texts, is however you understand it, whatever you think about punishment and reward, whatever you think about heaven and hell, the understanding the Zohar wants us to take away is the sense that actually death is something that happens before and after what we normally call death, and extends throughout that time period. In some ways that's very comforting, in some ways it's very terrifying, but hopefully it's an interesting and alternative view of understanding what it is to live and to die. We're a bit over time, but any reflections, thoughts, ideas? Anyone find this very offensive or very troubling, very inspiring? Anyone think it's completely wrong and the death is not a process, it's just an event and it just happens in one single instant?
I found it really interesting. And what you said now really made me think about the difficulty of sudden death. So it always interested me, the difference in bereavement. And now when you said it, it made it a bit clearer for me how, it's not a process.
Yeah, the trauma of sudden death is very different as a result. And, it's not only not being able to say goodbye, it's perhaps that the process is being interrupted in some way. And you could understand how that would be seen as a spiritual trauma of some kind from this point of view. It also implies something perhaps about what to and how to comfort mourners in that situation, and how to respond to them.
Esther and I have been studying the Laws of Veilus, which is like the laws of mourning at yeshiva. And it's really interesting to see this, because there's a really great thing that I learned, which is about how the laws of mourning are not actually there to help you process being sad. That's not really what they're about. It's actually a physical mechanism of part of the process of somebody's soul leaving the earth. And it's really interesting to see kind of reflection in the Zohar, like that same thing of like, oh, this is like, death isn't, the moment of death isn't actually what death is. Like, death is the moment before and what happens afterwards. I think that's great.
Yeah, it definitely is reflected in the way we approach death as Jews. Certainly our approach to burial and mourning, I think, reflects this idea that there's a graduation of the process, right? The 7 days of Shiva being the most acute, and the 30 days of Shloshim being a little bit less acute, but still mourning, and up to a year potentially for parents, as many of us unfortunately know too well who are here, right? There's a sense of actually it being a kind of titrated process of grieving even. And there's also an importance placed on the closure that's created by seeing and understanding the body being buried, and the fact that the soul is no longer there, right? Everything that we do in Tahara, in preparing a body for burial, is about recognizing that there's nothing there anymore, except that this was a vessel of something holy, which is now departed, and as a result, there's still more to do. Right, we still haven't finished our obligation because the body is still here, and as a result, it has a kind of inherent holiness. And there's something really nice about that in some way. It's much harder to deny death when you approach it the way that the Zohar suggests. And our culture is a very death-denying one. And arguably, if we embrace death more as a process that has a beginning, a middle, and an end, it would make it perhaps easier for people to integrate an understanding of death into part of their life, and it not to feel so sudden, which it often does, because people pretend it's not going to happen. Yeah, Janice.
You know, when you cover the mirrors during the Shiva, is that something to do with not seeing the reflection of the soul, or what was
people will tell you it's about vanity. That's nonsense. The reason you cover the mirrors is because the soul, as it leaves the body, can be trapped, the Zohar says, in reflective surfaces. It can be tricked into thinking that reflective surfaces are actually where it's meant to go. That's why you cover mirrors and spill out water. And anything else that's reflective is meant to be hidden to aid the soul in its journey out of the body and out of the house. Remember, people always died at home. So the assumption was that when someone dies, you have to cover everything reflective and open the windows. And all of that was designed to encourage the soul to leave the body and leave the home. The underlying assumption behind so much of what we do and what we think about death is the idea that death is very difficult, right? That it's very difficult to separate the soul from the body, that after a lifetime of living together, the two are very closely intertwined, and it is a difficult thing to split them apart. It takes a lot of pain and a lot of difficulty and a lot of time, and it's a gradual thing that can go awry. So the covering mirrors is actually not about vanity, although that's conventionally how it's understood, and much more about this rather spiritualist idea that the soul might be trapped somewhere along the way and needs to get out and go on.
Is that why, when I know we experienced when Jeff's mother died, we always felt that she was in that flat, and it took a while for the flat to feel empty. There seemed to be a period of time, and you felt that because she died at home, and you didn't want to touch anything that during that first week or so, because it just wasn't right. I don't know.
I mean, there's no science to it, but certainly in what we've seen tonight with this idea of the soul returning to the house for a week, or the idea the soul can be trapped, there's a sense that actually there's something that remains. It's not just a toggle switch on and off. That's clearly the underlying theme of all of this, is that, there's something that happens before and after, and that we don't really understand. But some of us, at least Rabbi Shimon, were able to interact with and engage with, and Rabbi Yitzhak was able to see and to understand. And perhaps we too can have the ability to understand and experience our own deaths, which is a very rare thing, right? What this calls for is a kind of conscious experiencing of death, which many people don't want to do, but in some ways can be very healthy and can be very therapeutic for the person dying to actually experience the death. It is rare that someone is cogent and conscious to be able to do that, but when they are, it's a very powerful thing. I've seen it firsthand, and it is a very powerful thing. And that's what we see with Rabbi Yitzhak, is his experiencing his death, arresting that, and dying much later with his teacher who saved him. And on Lag BaOmer, we can remember not only Shimon Bar Yochai, but also Rabbi Yitzhak, who ended up dying with him on his wedding feast on his day of death. And as a result, we can perhaps celebrate the two of them. And thank you guys very much for joining me. Rather a dark but hopefully interesting window into the Zohar's conception of death and the process therein. There's lots more about this, but this is a good indication from this little passage. This is unfortunately our last scheduled Zohar class for a long time. It's not on the books for next year's adult education program, I'm afraid. But if anyone's keen to keep learning, I'm happy to do so either one-on-one or in small groups or anything else, because I certainly enjoy it. It gives me a good excuse to open it up and learn myself. So thank you for joining me. Nice to see you all. May you live long and fruitful and happy lives. And good night.
Thanks very much.
Good night. Thank you.